The Purple Gang's rise to infamy began in the bustling immigrant neighborhoods of Detroit in the early 1900s. Most of its founding members were the children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, raised in poverty and surrounded by the chaos of urban America. With few legitimate opportunities, many turned to petty crime at a young age. Pickpocketing, extortion, and street-level violence became their education. What began as survival quickly turned into an organized enterprise. They called themselves the Purple Gang, a name that originated from a shopkeeper's remark likening them to spoiled meat, bruised and rotten. It was a name that stuck, and soon, it was whispered with fear across the city. The onset of Prohibition in 1920 opened the floodgates for an era of illegal opportunity. Detroit's unique geography, positioned right across the river from Canada, made it a perfect hub for smuggling alcohol into the United States. The Purple Gang seized the moment. They created an efficient and deadly network to transport booze from Windsor, Ontario into Detroit and beyond. They were quick to establish dominance over rival bootleggers, using brute force and targeted assassinations to consolidate control. Their operation was so expansive that Chicago's infamous Al Capone reportedly relied on the Purples for his supply of Canadian whiskey. But their power extended beyond just bootlegging. The Purple Gang operated as a full-fledged criminal syndicate, dabbling in gambling, extortion, labor racketeering, and contract killings. Their violent tactics were notorious. They didn't hesitate to intimidate or murder anyone who opposed them, including police officers and local officials. They corrupted law enforcement, bribed city politicians, and ensured silence through fear. As their reputation grew, so did their influence, and by the late 1920s, they were seen as untouchable. Newspapers reported their crimes, but witnesses were either too afraid or dead before they could testify. Despite their notoriety, internal strife began to gnaw away at the gang's foundation. With money pouring in and egos inflating, fractures began to form within the leadership. The Bernstein brothers Abe, Joe, Ray, and Izzy struggled to maintain control over younger, more reckless members. Factions formed, alliances shifted, and discipline waned. Violence within the gang increased, drawing unwanted attention from federal investigators who had begun cracking down on organized crime across the country. The most public and shocking example of their brutality came with the 1931 Collingwood Manor Massacre. 3 members of a rival gang were invited to an apartment under the pretense of peace talks. Instead, they were executed in cold blood. The massacre sent shockwaves throughout Detroit and prompted a new level of scrutiny from law enforcement. Though no convictions were made, public opinion turned sharply against the Purples. The bloodshed exposed the gang's ruthlessness in a way that could no longer be ignored. The increased pressure from law enforcement, combined with the internal decay of the gang, began to take its toll. Several members were arrested for unrelated crimes, and some began turning informant in exchange for reduced sentences. The Bernstein brothers, once the face of power in Detroit, started to lose their grip. By the mid-1930s, the gang's operations were in shambles. The once feared Purples now found themselves outmaneuvered by rising Italian and Irish mobs who seized control of the city's underworld. Though the gang's reign ended, their legend lived on. The Purple Gang had established themselves as pioneers of organized crime in Detroit. They were among the first to show how a small group of disenfranchised youths could manipulate an entire city through fear, money, and violence. Their influence inspired future criminal organizations, and their tactics, ruthless enforcement, bribery, strategic alliances became standard practice in organized crime across America. In the years that followed, the remaining members of the Purple Gang faded into obscurity or died violently. Some, like Abe Bernstein, managed to avoid prison and lived relatively quiet lives, while others disappeared entirely. The gang's name was no longer spoken with fear, but with curiosity, a dark chapter in Detroit's history that marked the city's flirtation with lawlessness and bloodshed during the Prohibition era. Looking back, the Purple Gang represents more than just another group of violent criminals. They symbolize the complicated intersection of immigrant struggle, economic desperation, and the American underworld. Their rise and fall reflect the volatility of organized crime and the way systemic corruption can allow violence to flourish unchecked. The Purples may be long gone, but their story continues to echo in the shadows of Detroit's past. As law enforcement continued to pursue what remained of the Purple Gang, they found themselves faced with a dilemma. The gang had, for so long, corrupted the very institutions meant to keep them in check, that rooting them out required extensive federal involvement. The Detroit Police Department had been infiltrated by the gang's money and influence, with some officers openly working with the criminals. The federal government, alarmed by the reach of organized crime during Prohibition, began to increase surveillance and build cases against known gang figures. However, the gang's practice of operating in secrecy and silencing witnesses made prosecution difficult. Public fear and fascination with the Purple Gang grew, especially in the wake of high-profile killings that shocked the community. Stories of machine gun battles, nighttime assassinations, and bodies dumped in the Detroit River became a regular feature in the headlines. The press often exaggerated these tales, but the gang's reputation thrived in this media spotlight. They became folklore, symbols of both terror and the harsh realities of inner-city life during America's Prohibition era. Detroit's citizens lived in a strange duality, fearful of violence, but almost desensitized to it, as if it were simply the cost of survival in a corrupt and turbulent city. One of the key reasons the Purple Gang had initially succeeded was because they filled a vacuum of power. Detroit's criminal scene had been fragmented before their rise, and the Purples offered brutal unity. They ran the streets with calculated force, enforced debts with deadly precision, and punished betrayal with public executions. But as the gang fractured and weakened, that vacuum began to reappear. Other mobs, particularly Italian syndicates connected to the national mafia, moved in, with more structured leadership, broader networks, and less public notoriety. Unlike the Purple Gang, these groups had learned to operate in the shadows, keeping a lower profile while still wielding immense power. The downfall of the Purple Gang wasn't just about law enforcement, it was about evolution. Organized crime was changing, becoming more sophisticated. The Purple Gang's flashy violence, while effective in the early days, eventually drew too much attention. Where they used brute force, other gangs used strategy. Where the Purples intimidated, others negotiated. The new era of organized crime favored those who could blend criminal enterprise with corporate-like structure. The Purple Gang, bred from street hustling and brute dominance, was not equipped to transition into this new criminal class. In later years, cultural references to the Purple Gang would reframe them in a semi-romanticized light. Books, films, and documentaries portrayed them as tragic antiheroes or misunderstood outlaws. While their violent deeds could not be excused, some viewed them as a product of their environment, young men with few options, drawn into crime by the pressures of poverty, racism, and a system that offered them no legitimate path to success. This narrative sparked debates about the role of society in creating criminals, and how cycles of poverty and exclusion often breed desperation and violence. Modern historians look back at the Purple Gang as a pivotal chapter in America's criminal history. They were among the first ethnically Jewish crime syndicates to rise to national prominence, breaking the stereotype that organized crime was solely controlled by Italian, Irish, or Eastern European groups. Their story sheds light on the broader American experience, how immigrants and their descendants navigated the challenges of assimilation, opportunity, and survival in a country that didn't always welcome them. Today, remnants of the Purple Gang's legacy can still be found in Detroit. Though the gang is long gone, their history lingers in the city's architecture, the streets they once controlled, and the cautionary tales passed down through generations. Murals, museum exhibits, and historical walking tours now touch on their influence, offering a glimpse into a darker time when crime ruled the city and fear walked alongside ambition. The Purple Gang remains a haunting reminder of how quickly power can corrupt and how even the most feared empire can crumble from within.